Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 234, The Aztecs. Today we shift our gaze from the Yucatan to the Central Valley of Mexico. The Maya are interesting, but remain shrouded in mist. The Aztecs, that's a misnomer by the way, I'll get to that, are much more relevant to our story. Their civilization is alive and kicking at the time the Spanish come calling in the early 16th century. The Aztecs, or Mexica, as they are properly known, and as I by and large will refer to them from this point forward, hence where we get Mexico, are an interesting and sophisticated civilization. What's much more interesting is just how developed that civilization was leading into Cortes's conquest. While the various Western diseases would quickly decimate their population, the Mexica were still formidable in 1521. Frankly, anyone who was placing bets would have assumed that the Mexica would have been favored over Hernan Cortes and a handful of Spaniards. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Today, we introduce the Mexica/Aztecs and determine for ourselves who these people were that the Spanish would conquer. It took several centuries for the people we now commonly call the Aztecs to come down from the north and occupied the central valley of what is today Mexico. And even as they came down, the Aztecs, Mexica, had to jockey for power with several other civilizations, who each either came down or who were there when the Aztecs arrived. Hence, the Aztecs had to first do to other people what the Spanish would later do to them. But let's back up a bit before we go forward. About 11,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended. The ice melted, the sea level rose, and the Bering Strait, the land bridge that covered the land between what is today Siberia and Alaska, evaporated, separating the old world and the new. Some of the massive game species that had been hunted for thousands of years became extinct. Climates grew warmer, plants flourished. Everywhere on Earth, different hungry Homo sapiens experimented with eating more of the plant's blossoms and fruits and roots and seeds and stalks. It didn't matter if they lived where the weather was warm or cool, or if the land was woody and shaded or hot and dry. Mankind did this everywhere. Yet despite the commonality of their actions, differences that began to emerge at this time would prove crucial to human history. When the people of Eurasia later met those of the Americas, decisions that human beings made about farming in those early times would determine their fates, in the sense that the past determined their degree of strength relative to one another. It's a tale that you need to understand if you're going to understand the rise and the fall of the Aztecs. In most places, of course, men hunted and women gathered. In their lives, always on the very edge of survival, these women noticed everything in the natural world. They saw that the plants grew from the seeds they sowed, some of the seeds of their favorite plants in damp earth, and returned to gather the fruits of their labor the following year, when the hunt drew them back to the same area. They learned, for example, that if you gathered seeds only from the bushes that grew the most berries, the next generation of plants would yield even more. They learned, in other words, how to domesticate. The women told the men what they deduced, and the men who valued survival listened to them. Almost everywhere, humans became, what we would call part-time farmers. However, hunting and fishing remained the main affairs. It was the carcasses of animals that humankind depended upon. People gradually did become full-time farmers when and where it made sense. That is, they dedicated themselves to cultivating the local flora instead of hunting, only when the game grew thin on the ground. And they also had in their environment a constellation of protein-rich plants that could support human life. Not that all farmers were necessarily happier or better off than hunter-gatherers, or smarter, or more moral, nor did they always invent the same things in the same order. For example, the ancient Andean farmers never thought of straining plant fibers through screens to create paper on which to write, as farmers in the Old World did. Instead, they wrote in knots and braids along colored cords and tied them together to record their prayers and keep their tax records. And the Europeans, later famous for fighting, were not the only ones or the first ones to create explosives. Chinese did that. The point is that slowly but surely, farmers developed mightier civilizations, in the sense of being able to defeat people who had not developed comparable weapons and goods, and whose populations simply didn't grow equivalently. But focusing for a moment on the Americas. For a long time, the ancient ancestors of the Aztecs continued as hunter-gatherers, with only a part-time interest in farming. For at least 5 millennia, past the time when agriculture emerged with force in the Old World, most peoples in the New World were still hunter-gatherers. The problem is, of course, that plants comparable to wheat simply didn't exist in the New World. Now later, of course, Native Americans would be known for their reliance on corn, along with beans and squash. But ancient corn, which is a plant called teosinte, was merely a wild grass with a tuft of tiny kernels, smaller than today's baby corn. Ancient wheat was almost exactly like today's wheat, but teosinte was not even close to modern corn, its nutritional value being significantly less. It required thousands of years of effort on the part of Mexico's women to turn those little tufts into what we would recognize as ears of corn. They occasionally planted the larger kernels from the biggest tufts, just as they had experimented with other plants. In the meantime, they and their menfolk followed the deer in the other game. Even when the ears of corn began to grow to a substantial size, scraping off the kernels and eating them still left a person hungry. Eventually, the women began to notice that when they ate corn at the same time as they ate beans, they were better nourished. Far more so than in Europe, the rise of agriculture was a long and protracted process that occurred in fits and starts. But the shift did eventually occur. By 3500 BCE, a few groups in Mexico were farming corn in earnest. By 1800 BCE, many more were doing the same. But there had been several millennia of delay in comparison with the Old World, a fact that, as we know, is going to matter a lot in the future. Now, in the coastal and river areas of Mesoamerica, some people had already established permanent villages. These people subsisted primarily on different types of seafood. As early as 1500 BCE, the earliest such group that we know was forming. We call these people the Olmecs. They divided up the necessary labor to do more than just grow food. Eventually, the Mexica as well would become just as dependent on corn, or maize as it's often called, as their neighbors. By the time of Cortes, the poorer Mexica consumed about 3.5 pounds of maize per day. But the Olmecs did much more than cultivate maize. They established a calendar, while talented artists created sculptures that many still wonder at today. The evolution, though, of corn and beans as the staple of the Olmec diet slowly but surely transformed the Mesoamerican world. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the corn and beans culture complex spread east and west from the isthmus. An Olmec influence expanded, its elements of grandeur firing the imaginations of others. To the east, as we know, great stone pyramids soon rose above the jungle canopy. The Maya artists who built them added paint from lime or plant pigments. Others had learned to weave twisted strands of wild cotton into beautiful cloth, and soon colorful pennants fluttered in the breeze. They carved their writings on great slabs of stone that they set before the pyramids for all the world to see, commemorating the triumphs of their kings. Eventually, this culture spread to the Fertile Crescent, the Central Valley of Mexico, where several successive civilizations rose and fell. Around 200 BCE, a city-state called Culiculu flourished until it was destroyed by a volcanic eruption in the 1st century CE. The first city that would take Culiculu's place was called Teotihuacan, which is not Tenochtitlan. Still, it's in the same place. And today, we know it as Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world. And it would be one of the largest cities, by the way, when the Spanish arrived. But it didn't start out that way. Teotihuacan would dominate the central basin of Mexico. The valley itself is perfect for farming. It had damp, rich soil. It's essentially a basin without drainage. The valley was surrounded with a chain of mountains, which formed a literal barricade against outside incursion. Now, it was the people, though, that came from the north that gave it its central location, its name, Teotihuacan. It meant holy place, or, quote, the place of people who become gods, end quote. These first newcomers from the north who stumbled upon the city's inspirational ruins must have been stunned at what they saw. The old city lay between two great pyramids, each of which was aligned with a towering mountain behind it. Each offered an inspiration to the power and divinity of the earth. Between them there was a large street or avenue, along which ran the houses and schools of the temples of people who had long vanished. Turning down the side streets, which were laid out in a grid pattern, and wandering around the remnants of an earlier world, the newcomers found hundreds of apartments opening into little courtyards. They found painted walls and aqueducts. In the temple precinct, carved snakes slithered down grand stairways. In the past, the hum of the city's life had been audible from a goodly distance. Between the 200s and 600 CE, in the wake of Culico's destruction by the volcano, the population of the 20-square-mile city rose to an astounding 50,000. There were sumptuous homes for the nobility, but each neighborhood was impressive in its own right. So what happened? Where did these people go? We know that around 650 CE, a great crisis shook the world that lived under the sway of Teotihuacan. The working people, peasant farmers, or maybe even slaves, rose in revolt. We know they burned the palaces and ceremonial precincts, but left untouched the apartments of ordinary people. Archaeologists have looked at this for years, and we know now that this wasn't a foreign invasion. Foreign enemies always try to destroy the common people's homes and livelihoods, but they don't destroy great monumental architecture. They want to acquire it. So, as a result, we can assume that Teotihuacan was brought to its knees by a sort of insurrection. Whether that was led by the peasant class, whether that was a slave revolt, is something we'll never know. But the reality is that the fall of Teotihuacan created yet another power vacuum in the region that would someday become Mexico City. It did not remain vacant for long. To the north, there was always a steady stream of nomadic peoples who knew about the fertile Central Valley and were always eager to take a chance to put down their roots there. As I talked about in the episodes on the Maya, two of the most important military technological innovations to sweep Mesoamerica during the 500 CE were 1, the throwing spear, and 2, the bow and arrow. By 500 CE, the bow and arrow were an essential element of any warrior's gear in the Southwest. From the American Southwest, these people migrated down to the Central Valley. As an aside, while the bow and arrow might seem primitive to us, remember that Europe during the same period is in the throes of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. An effective army of Mesoamerican bowmen would have done just fine against an army of Goths. Waves of conquering nomads descended into central Mexico. Presumably, those driven out were forced out by other nomads, or drought, or a combination thereof. Initially, these groups were almost exclusively young men. They were there to pillage, not put down roots. The people these warriors encountered were, by and large, farmers. And by and large, these farmers did not possess the same military technology. Hence, the migrants could take what they wanted and dictate the terms of their future residency in the area, if they so choose. There are all kinds of stories about these men passed down for generations. One good example goes as follows. Quote, "They lived armed with the bow and arrow. It is said that they had bee-string arrows, fire arrows, arrows that followed people. It is even said that their arrows could seek things out. When the people went hunting, an arrow of theirs could go anywhere. If the hunting was something above, they would see it come back with an eagle. If the arrow saw nothing above, why then it came downward towards something else, maybe a puma or a jaguar or a snake, or a deer or a quail or a rabbit. The people would follow along to see what their arrow had brought back to them." End quote. We need to keep in mind that there were no horses in the Americas at this time. So our image of the Apache galloping in from later centuries is not something that fits here. Still, these bow-wielding warriors had a tremendous advantage over their counterparts. These are the people who would, in time, become the Aztecs, the Mexica. Over hundreds of years, they would slowly settle down more and more, plant corn, and master the complex calendar of central Mexico. The calendar, of course, was a byproduct of the links between central Mexico and the Yucatan. Certainly, just like we saw with the Maya, there were varying levels of understanding when it came to this calendar. Even village children, however, had a rudimentary grasp of its basics. High priests understood the esoteric branches of its science. Now, in essence, the Aztec calendar had two ongoing cycles of time. One was the solar calendar, which consisted of 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 unnamed days at the end, for a total of 365 days. The other was a purely ceremonial calendar. This one had 13 months of 20 days, for a total of 260. The two streams of time always ran parallel to one another. That way one always knew where one stood in terms of the sun and the ceremonial calendar. On a simple level, we do something similar today. We have a solar calendar and a shorter week-long calendar based primarily on Nordic gods. Almost all these wanderers who settled in central Mexico came from the north. Many shared a common cultural past, saying that they came from Chicamox, or, quote, the place of the 7 caves, end quote. Other groups said they came from a place called Aztlan. Scholars today can point to no real place of origin for these people. It's likely that Aztlan never existed, or was purely mythical. The founding of Teotihuacan itself had a mythical past, like many cities of antiquity. Now, according to legend, one day an eagle landed on a cactus on an island in the center of a great lake, a snake captured in its beak. There, the people who would become the Mexica decided to build their great city. There were, of course, practical advantages to this site. The lake provided ample water for growing crops. It was rich in fish and waterfowl to hunt. And in time, it would be the auspicious location for a new, growing major city, Tenochtitlan. The city itself stood 7,000 feet above sea level. It was 200 miles from the sea to the west, 150 to the east. It was about as safe as any fortress city in the world. When Cortes arrived, access to the city was available only through 3 causeways. The Mexica could raise these bridges and render the island totally inaccessible. A contemporary poem even read, "Who could conquer Tenochtitlan? Who could shake the foundation of heaven?" Still, at the time, it is important to recognize that the Mexica were able to settle on the lake precisely because no one else wanted it. It was not suitable for agriculture alone, and the Mexica were dependent on the fish and other products that the lake provided. Across the lake, however, another group of people called the Xomochila did very well by constructing things that are called chinapas. These were gardens built in the shallows alongside the lake by piling up mud and silt. Then, after the retaining wall had been strengthened by reeds, farmers would pile in dirt, creating the perfect growing atmosphere for corn and beans. These were hard to build, but abundantly fertile. The Mexica were quick to copy their neighbors' example and began constructing their own chinapas. Augmented with fish from the lake, the Mexica had more than enough food to thrive. And as they thrived, the people decided to create another solid platform, this time in the very center of the lake. There they piled up gravel on the very spot that the eagle had once landed. In time, it would be the foundation for a great pyramid. The subject of Mexica/Aztec slavery is one that has become a little muddled over time. The problem is that for so long, the Mexica, as well as other indigenous peoples in North and South America, were treated as savages and nothing more. And as a result, recent scholars have been loath to say anything bad about them. In other words, the Aztecs should get only good PR. Since slavery is decidedly bad, it needs to stay out. As a result, more recent scholars have dismissed allegations of Mexica slavery as forms of something like indentured servitude, maybe serfdom. Yet a more critical lens acknowledges that the Mexica did in fact keep slaves. Slaves, both men and women, did make up a significant part of the Mexica population, and it doesn't do us any good to pretend that that wasn't the case. As with any slave-holding society, the experience of each individual slave varied with their master and what kind of a slave they were, i.e. household versus agriculture. But I think it's safe to say the experience probably wasn't good. Over the decades and centuries beginning around the year 1300 CE, the men of Tenochtitlan slowly but surely reduced their neighbors around the lake to a subservient status. Each year, the warriors would march out, and generally, each year, they returned victorious. The most important campaign early on was against Cuernavaca, a region to the south where wild cotton grew so well that people had begun domesticating it. It was a valuable region because cotton just doesn't grow well in the mountains. We don't get any details about the campaign. But it was a long campaign, and by the end, the people of Tenochtitlan and Cuernavaca were allies. Still, during the 14th century CE, the Mexica were not the only and most powerful people in the region. Central Mexico at this time was still dominated by a people called the Tepanec from the north. Tenochtitlan was more or less a vassal of this dominant state, but they were, of course, the favorite vassal. The Tepanec generally picked the Mexica to be their lieutenants in the south. They collected the tribute and passed it along to the Tepanec, though I think it's safe to assume they probably kept some for themselves. Then, in 1426, a major event happened that would alter the course of pre-Columbian history. The powerful ruler of an important town called Azcapotzalco died, and his many sons immediately commenced a civil war for the throne. These fits of violence after a ruler's death were common in Mexico at the time. Moreover, because the royal families of these different dynasties intermarried with significant frequency, one town's civil war often became the cause for a larger regional conflict. After the new and youngest son took the throne and was killed, the new ruler of Azipataco started putting feelers out, looking for allies. This had the opposite effect that he had intended. Before long, a triple alliance of the Mexica and 2 other ethnic groups were marching against the town, and within a year, Azipataco had fallen. This brought into being the status quo, which would more or less exist at the time Hernan Cortes arrived. The Mexica now ruled the Central Valley as the head of a triumvirate alongside 2 other peoples, the Texoco and the Tlacopan. The 3 kings of these 3 people worked together to bring down their enemies, collect tribute, manage migration, etc. Nothing happened in the valley that at least one of these 3 men didn't know about. Thus, to say that Hernan Cortes confronted the quote-unquote Aztecs in the early 16th century would be a bit of a mistake. This was an alliance of 3 ethnic groups, each of which might provide an overall king, as we will see. As one historian put it, quote, "This was no Rome," end quote. The Mexica had no interest in forcing cultural assimilation. Their rule was much more like that of ancient Assyria. They wanted compliance and they wanted tribute. If they got those things, then everything was fine. If not, well, as we'll see, that's what Jaguar warriors were for. While politically, the situation hadn't changed much. Certainly, economically, it had. Each lesser king that fell under the sway of one of the 3 groups, part of the triumvirate, found itself part of an interconnected system of tribute. And this was a system that greatly benefited the 3 main groups in their respective areas. One of the most important forms of tribute that had to be provided were victims for religious sacrifice. This aspect of the Mexica system is crucial to understanding how the region as a whole operated when Cortes arrived. Lesser kings who became the vassals of Tenochtitlan had 2 choices. 1, they could go to war against the neighbors and get victims for sacrifice. Or 2, they could volunteer their own people for sacrifice. As option 2 was likely to end your reign as king, and probably your life as well, this forced central Mexico into a never-ending cycle of minor periphery conflicts. This policy destabilized the outer fringes of the Mexica world, but kept the nucleus safe, because subservient tribes had to use their resources to fight their neighbors and had little energy or time to rebel. If a town fought against the Mexica with any significant degree of success, yet ultimately lost, its fate was worse. For an example, the Aztecs to the northeast fought back, as we're told, like wild animals. But in the end, the Mexica brought them down. Quote, "The soldiers from all the allied provinces took many captives, both men and women, for they and the Mexica entered the city, burned the temple, sacked and robbed the place. They killed the old, the young, boys and girls, annihilating without mercy everyone they could, with great cruelty and with the determination to remove all traces of the Aztec people from the face of the earth," end quote. Their story was to serve a lesson to other potential rebels. And from all we can tell, it did. When most people think of the Mexica/Aztecs, they probably think of human sacrifice, if they think of anything at all. But there are horrendous misconceptions about this practice, many driven by popular media. Not every sacrifice victim had his or her heart removed while they were still alive, to the screaming ecstasy of those standing below the temple. Most of the victims were prisoners of war, and they were given to the gods that the Mexica firmly believed controlled everything in our world. The gods asked of mankind to give up what they held most dear, flesh and blood. Often this took the form of individual bleeding, just like the Maya did. But occasionally the gods demanded a human sacrifice, or the world might come to an end. Early on, the Mexica sacrificed mostly their own people. But as they increasingly became the winners in this system, this game that we call geopolitics, the victims became war captives. What this meant was that the number of people sacrificed in any given year might vary wildly depending on the outcome of various wars and local politics. Mexica's society was broken into different classes. The nobility made up what's called the Pili class. These were the powerful men who might own slaves and have several wives. Below them were the Masjuli class. This was the vast majority of people. Amongst this class of people was everyone above slaves, essentially. Now, there were gender roles, but that doesn't mean that the role of women was devalued like it was in the Western sense. Women's jobs were seen as essential. Cooking, cleaning, raising children, these were really crucial tasks. So while the world of women and men might be separated for this Masjuli class, it was never really seen as unequal. In terms of what we know about Mexica's societal values, they believed that each person had good and evil within them. There was no Calvinist sense of the predestined. And people had to do evil a lot, by the way. That is to say, because permanent truces didn't really exist in the Mexica world, war was a perpetual companion. In order to maintain balance between the different ethnic factions, kings would rotate and name successors from different dynasties. This was how, in the mid-15th century, when the king of Tenochtitlan died, his successor came from a different dynasty. This man's name was Moctezuma, and he was the grandfather of the man who would bear his name and meet Cortes. Moctezuma I ruled for 29 years and expanded Mexica holdings further. Relatively early on in his reign, Tenochtitlan was hit by drought and then locusts. Of course, the Mexica were an overwhelmingly agricultural people, as was everywhere on the world at that point. But from 1450 to 1454, the land simply didn't yield any corn. So people prayed to the gods. Quote, "Here are the common folk, the Mashutin, who are the tail and wings of society. They are perishing. Their eyelids are swelling. The mouths drying out. They become bony, bent, emaciated. Thin are the commoners' lips, and blanched are their throats. With pallid eyes live the babies, the children of all ages, those who totter, those who crawl, those who spend their time turning dirt with potsherds, those who live sitting on the ground, those who lie on the boards, who fill the cradles. All the people face torment, affliction. They witness that which makes humans suffer. Already there are none who are passed over." Unquote. Young men left home looking for opportunity. Children were sold into slavery just so that the rest of the family could eat. Moctezuma responded by launching an attack against a political entity called Chalco, which was no more by 1455. Between 1455 and 1479, the Mexica were at peace. Tenochtitlan was now a totally different city. In the late 1470s and 1480s, it was a far cry from the scruffy, marshy town inhabited by whoever could control it. Under the most recent king in Moctezuma, victories had multiplied, and the Mexica's relative wealth and power were now truly significant in the region. The Central Valley of Mexico at this point contained about 1.5 million people, most of them farmers. In the very center of this fertile basin, on this little island of 5.5 square miles, there lived as many as 50,000 people. Counting the people of all the other local kingdoms who clustered on the far shore of the lake. There were perhaps 100,000 in the wider urban area. Tenochtitlan's population growth had outpaced that of other regions. This was partly because of the city's wealth and political domination. But victory and war had also brought more captive women to the city, and, as you can expect, more babies as a result. The city's location in the center of a great lake rendered it almost a given that its markets would dominate the region. It was like the hub of a great wheel, with each individual spoke community tied to the center through trade. Because the city had grown so quickly from scratch, rather than evolving gradually, like Paris or London, its construction was planned and organized. The buildings ranged along orderly, straight streets. Ordinary households consisted of adobe buildings on 3 or 4 sides of a central courtyard. The flat roofs held gardens, and sometimes additional small rooms, often used for storage. Generally, each woman had her own hearth, whether the women of the house were co-wives, mother-in-laws, or daughter-in-laws. And each had their own supply of spindles, looms, grinding stones, pots, brooms, dustbins, as well as clothes and jewelry. In the prominent location of the home, men kept their own gear hanging on the wall, usually handmade weapons, battle headdresses, mementos of war. There was no furniture. People sat and slept on thick mats and pillows. Over the simple structures, of course, loomed large neighborhood temples in the form of pyramids, with highly decorated compounds near each of these for the nobility. The original aqueduct meant to feed the city fresh water collapsed decades earlier in 1449. Now, a newer and stronger aqueduct, significantly higher, delivered substantially larger quantities of fresh water to the city. This one had 2 water troughs, so that in the event one had to be repaired or cleaned, the city could still receive fresh water. All of this peace and prosperity had been the result of a series of peaceful transitions of power for the Mexica. After Moctezuma died in 1469, his already chosen successor smoothly slid into the machine of power without issue. But this proved short-lived. In 1473, Tlatelolco, one of the 3 ethnic groups of the triumvirate, decided they wanted a bigger share of the spoils and revolted. It didn't go well for them. Tenochtitlan was now too powerful. Eventually, it's not clear if it was days or months later, the Tlatelolco, would come to regret what they had done. It is said that in the final battle that saw their demise, even the women fought. It didn't matter. Tenochtitlan was now supreme. Between 1473 and 1490, Mexica power grew significantly. Then, in 1502, the royal clans chose Moctezuma the Younger, or Montezuma II, as their next king. And this would be the man who would meet Hernan Cortes. In 1502, Montezuma was a young and charismatic figure. He was a hard man with a hard agenda. His goal was nothing less than the creation of a true state apparatus. He wanted to build a more modern bureaucracy, do away with the old triumvirate completely, and ensure that the king could exercise power beyond mere face-to-face circumstances. Montezuma wanted to increase the level of direct control. He started by setting up 38 administrative provinces. There were later 55, each with its own tightly organized bureaucracy. Representatives of his government were sent to live in each. Permanent military garrisons were built at key locations in order to support the Mexica, who were scattered far and wide. The chain of command between the highest officials in Tenochtitlan and those lesser figures who lived locally were carefully delineated and then recorded in documents that illustrated these political relationships. The prior Triple Alliance rulers had encouraged interregional trade. Local markets sold such useful items as copper needles, jars of salt, small bronze bells. There was no reason to change this much. Only rarely did a recalcitrant local noble find his compound attacked and his lineage destroyed. Generally, conflict wasn't what Montezuma wanted. He wanted peace, prosperity, consolidation. The local Mexica's official's most important task was to collect all the required tribute on time. They continued to work on synchronizing the various small hinterlands calendars so that it would be clear when the tribute was due. They held public ceremonies, and they delineated what each person owed. But tribute collection was no longer the officials' only task. They were there to support merchants who were engaged in long-distance trade. The officials oversaw local diplomatic negotiations, concerning, for the most part, chiefly marriages and inheritance. They also would act as judges, upholding certain laws of justice, especially regarding landholding. They intervened with some frequency in property distribution. Years long after the Spaniards were in power, some local families were still simmering about Tenochtitlan's decisions, which actually, even after the Spanish takeover, were generally still in force. This vision of a well-regulated body politique was in many ways the product of generations of work. Over generations, the socio-political framework that tied the Mexica world together had developed and coalesced. Families remained the foundation of the state. Then families were grouped into kin-based clans called calpulli. Calpulli had their own gods, priests, and traditions. Marriage, outside the calpulli, though not impossible, was unusual. Calpulli was the body which mobilized the Mexica for war, for cleaning the streets, and for attending festivals. Farmers of land which had been granted by the calpulli gave a proportion of their crops, we think a third, to that body for delivery back to the imperial administration. Through the calpulli, the farmer heard requests or orders from the emperor. There were probably as many as 80 of these just in Tenochtitlan alone. Earlier, the leader of the calpulli, the calpulic, had apparently been elected. But by the 15th century, that office had become hereditary and lifelong. The most powerful calpulli was in a suburb called Quiopan, where lived the so-called long-distance merchants. These actually had a bad name among the Mexica because they were supposedly greedy. But they were praised, and frankly, they were used by Montezuma and others to further the needs of the Mexica people. The calpulli, in turn, were grouped together to form what was called an altepel. Often, these groups were into greater altepel, and Tenochtitlan was a microcosm of the larger Mexica world in this way. The city itself was divided into 4 quarters. Each quarter had the exact same number of nobles, pili, and commoners, masuli. Now, there are signs, however, that in later years, the relative peace between these groups was a little strained. As the nobles brought home increasing numbers of captive women, they had more children. The families of these then threatened to become unmanageable, especially relative to the commoners who were there. As far back as the reign of Montezuma I, it had been concluded that the king had too many children to expect the commoners to support them all with his tribute. He was remembered as saying, quote, "Not all my children will rule," end quote. And he concluded that they should be trained to support themselves as elite artisans, such as sculptors and scribes. But the problem still only grew. One old woman in the 16th century remembered how it had been in her girlhood in the late 1400s. Quote, "Back when I was growing up, there was an infinite number of nobles. How many noble houses there were! The palaces of those who were nobles and rulers. It was like one big palace. There were countless minor lords and lesser relatives, and one could not count the commoners who were the dependents or the slaves. They were like ants." End quote. All this created just a ton of logistical problems. The nobility had to work out complex understandings as to which family members would count as nobles, in the sense of depending on tribute from commoners, because the nobility had ballooned to a point that the commoners simply couldn't support them. And so the organization of each kalpuli or clan had to be tightened. Now, under Montezuma II, there were different groups of nobles, some who supervised the commoners and others who supervised both. Sort of a Supreme Court, I guess. Now, no laws were ever written down. Rather, Mexica society was driven by several mutually understood principles. Adultery, for example, was a crime punishable by death, either strangulation or normally stoning. A married woman could never have sexual relations outside her marriage. A man could, but if the woman he had relations with was married, then he too was guilty. Montezuma also controlled the markets. His many nobles carefully scrutinized the ongoings there and reported any abnormalities back up the chain of command. Later, a Spaniard who would see the markets reported back, quote, "We were astounded at the great number of people and the quantities of merchandise, and at the orderliness and good arrangements that prevailed, for we'd never seen anything like that before. The chieftains who accompanied us pointed everything out. Every kind of merchandise was kept separate and had a fixed place and a market for it." End quote. One could even go to effectively a pre-modern restaurant there. There were stalls selling pre-made tortillas, little cakes, and squash cut into ready-to-eat pieces. Doctors and healers, both men and women, also operated out of the market. They sold a variety of herbs that experience had taught would help with a variety of ailments, anything from blisters to itchy skin and fever. They would also cast stones, kind of like throwing dice, to try to determine the best treatment for a mysterious ailment. Later on, some Spanish friars would try to insist there had been some doctors who dealt only with efficacious herbs, while others preyed on people's superstitions. It was the friars' way of trying to save the reputation of some indigenous doctors in European eyes. To be clear, though, everybody did about the same thing. It wasn't just the markets and the courts that Montezuma and his government increasingly controlled, but the temples and the schools as well. In Tenochtitlan, there wasn't any tension between religion and civil government. Indeed, the very idea of that was incomprehensible. The monarch had supreme religious duties. His responsibility, like his palace, was distinct from that of the priesthood. He had civil duties. His judges and their officials administered civil law. But he had a mandate, which he considered came from the gods. And he used that to preserve society by playing on people's natural sense of obligation rather than imposition, which is something very similar that we saw when we looked at the Maya 2 weeks ago. But Emperor Montezuma II took all this further. All officials, even all priests, were henceforth to come from the highest class. In practice, this meant members of a large, extended royal family. Even within that great family, offices tended to become hereditary. Quite logically, from his point of view, Montezuma closed the special schools to all but the highborn. Previously, promising boys of humble birth could aspire to become priests or even more. But the social structure, by 1518, had become more rigid, more fixed. Education was different depending on who you were in the Mexica world, just like it was in Europe. Girls learned their prayers, as well as domestic tasks like spinning and weaving. Every boy studied warfare, unless he had already been selected as a priest. Merchants' children likewise were kept apart. They learned their trade from their fathers as their fathers had before them. These two groups aside, every Mexica boy had to learn to become a warrior. As older teenagers, they would accompany more seasoned veterans to the battlefield. There, they learned how to take captives by separating one warrior from his fellows and then acting as a team to bring them down. Boys who excelled at fighting brought honor and opportunity to their families. Those who did not brought shame and derision. It was a sum-zero game. In the meantime, some other boys were educated to become priests. The priests who trained them, who held such power, seem to have encompassed a wide range of personalities. I think we've seen this story before and again. Some are remembered as wise and thoughtful, others, unsurprisingly, were brutal. They were there, after all, I suppose, to teach a new generation to take over their duties in what was an incredibly bloody game. But they could be downright cruel. When a student who'd committed a serious infraction was found out, the priests could attempt to drown him or seem to do so. Quote, they, the priests, plunged him under the water and dragged him, then went pulling him along by the hair. They kicked him. As he swam under the water, churning, beating, and swirling it up as he went, he escaped the hands of the priest. When he finally reached the shore, he lay half dead, breathing at last, gasping, last in his agonies, end quote. At this point, if the infraction was enough, the boy's parents were allowed to take him home. That being said, there is kind of a caveat here. If the parents could prove that their child was not a good swimmer, then he didn't have to do the contest. The empire that Montezuma ruled was large, prosperous, and powerful. Mexica ruled some 125,000 square miles. This is about 1.5 times the size of England. Tenochtitlan ruled 3 distinct zones: the tropics near the oceans, a temperate area, and a mountainous region. Hence, the residents of the great city could expect a wide variety of goods and products. By the time that Cortes arrived, however, the Mexica Empire seems to have settled into its territorial limits. Successive emperors had tried to extend their power further into the tropics but failed. Montezuma's empire was also remarkably cohesive. Natal, in some form, was spoken throughout, and their army was strong. It's hard to determine exactly how large the Mexica army was, because the population was so committed to war. It's sometimes hard to tell exactly who was a warrior and who wasn't. There are estimates from emperors having 24,000 men with them. Then there are others in different campaigns. There's estimates of armies of the size of 200,000. Now, these forces, regardless of the size, were usually organized in cohorts of about 8,000 men, divided into companies of 100 and coordinated by a captain. These men maintained peace and imperial rule by the constant threat and, let's say, sometimes, use of terror. There are lots of references in the legal codes to decisions to, quote, wipe out all traces of a place, end quote. Successful wars ended with the burning of the enemy's temple, and brutality must have occurred. There were many small wars or shows of force, for the empire was just so large, the terrain so rugged, that the armies of Tenochtitlan were certainly constantly on the move, putting down rebellions as well as conquering new cities. This is all to say that the empire that Cortes was about to come smashing into was formidable, cohesive, and should have been ready to crush him. But of course, it isn't going to. And next time, we turn to the Spaniard side to see those expeditions that were going to set the groundwork for Cortez's later invasion and conquest of Mexico.